Hello, my name is Justin Stairs, and this is the Brussels Signal Studio. We're doing a video interview today. I'm very happy to be talking to Adam Starzynski, who is editor of the Visegrad 24 service, which is based in Warsaw, and you might have heard of it because it has a huge online presence. They're following news from across Central and Eastern Europe. We're here today to talk about Poland. I should start by saying hello, Adam. How are things going?
All good here in Warsaw. Thank you for the invitation.
You're very welcome. We're here to talk about Poland and Polish politics, in fact, and that means, of course, Poland and the European Union. Relations between the two not particularly good at the moment. Our chat is timely in that we have elections coming up in Poland on October the 15th. So if it's okay with you, Adam, what I'd like to do is start off with the domestic politics, and then we'll move on to Poland and the EU, and also let's touch on Poland and Ukraine. So, elections coming up. The Law and Justice Party is doing well in the polls, but what is their chance, in your opinion, of them holding on to their majority? How is it looking today?
It looks like it's a bit of a 50-50 situation, whether there will be a law and justice government, whether a minority government or a coalition government, or whether the opposition will come to power. The Law and Justice Party is riding fairly high in polls compared to a few months ago, somewhere around 37-38% according to most polls. In the previous election they were up to 42-43, so slightly higher than currently, but nevertheless, taking into consideration that they have been in power for 8 years, it has to be said that they have managed to keep support at a high level. When it comes to the election result, a lot will be up to how the smaller parties do. Apart from the Law and Justice Party, we also have the Civic Platform Party, the main opposition party, which is led by Donald Tusk, the previous president of the European Council, so he might be well known to many Europeans. His party has around 29-30% in polls. And then there are a number of smaller parties that range between 4 to 12-13% in support. So it depends on how they will do to a large degree on what kind of government will be formed.
Indeed, of course, here in Brussels we know Mr. Tusk very well, a former head of the European Council. But in terms of the smaller parties, of course, the news story, if I'm not mistaken, in recent months has been the rise of the new boys on the block, the Confederation Party, which is itself an alliance of smaller parties. Maybe you could say where they stand. I mean, as I understand it, they're to the right of the Law and Justice Party. Is that correct?
They are. When it comes to economic policy especially, because even if the Law and Justice Party have received or been given rather a reputation in Western Europe as a party that is very conservative and right-wing, when it comes to economic policy, they are centrist or even slightly center-left. On the other hand, the Confederation Party is a typical right-wing party when it comes to economics. They want a smaller state, they want less taxes, they want easier or more simple tax rules. So that is probably the main bone of contention between the Law and Justice Party and the Confederation Party. However, when it comes to values, morality issues, then both parties are definitely right-wing and would probably see a lot of agreement when it comes to issues such as abortion, gay marriage, or migration, for example.
Right, and if I understand it, the Confederation have been playing their cards close to their chest, as you might expect, in that they've not signalled that they're willing to join a coalition with either Mr. Tusk or Mr. Kaczynski. Is that correct?
That is correct. Currently, at least according to polls, it does look like they could be the kingmakers. But so far, the opposition claims that they are likely to rule with the Law and Justice Party, with the current government. On the other hand, the Law and Justice Party is saying that that is highly unlikely, and that probably Confederation would be willing to rule together with the opposition. But they themselves, as you mentioned, they prefer to keep distance to both these options. They usually repeat a slogan that they have, saying that we are not here to be invited to sit down at the table with you. Instead, we are here to flip the table. So they are riding on a very populist and anti-establishment rhetoric.
And is it also the case that they're also young leaders as opposed to the traditional, the older leaders that have been exchanging power for a number of years now? That's another point in their favor, right?
Absolutely, that is true. When it comes to the main parties, Donald Tusk's Civic Platform and the ruling Law and Justice Party, there we have party leaders that are both well above 60 or even 70. In the case of Mr. Kaczynski, they have been around on the political scene since the early 2000s. They have been both in power, while the Confederation Party, at least previously, you could say that there are two main parties within the Confederation Party, or rather forces now, since they have both merged into a single party. But we have the nationalists from the so-called the nationalist movement, Ruch Narodowy, and then we have the libertarians from Nowa Nadzieja, or New Hope. Previously, New Hope was led by Janusz Korwin-Mikke, another person that many Europeans might remember, as he was an MEP in the European Parliament, where he was infamous for making very controversial statements. This is a gentleman who now is 80 years old. He has also been a veteran of Polish politics. I think he first made his entry on the scene in the 70s as a eccentric man in a bow tie who was a big fan of Milton Friedman at a time when naturally Poland was a communist state. However, he handed over the reins of his faction to Sławomir Mencen, who is a young up-and-comer in his mid-30s and who has excellent social media skills. He is especially, you could say, the king of the Polish political TikTok sphere. So he has been able to use that to his benefit. And then the other leader of the nationalist movement is Krzysztof Bosak, who back in 2005 became the youngest MP in the Polish parliament when he was elected at the age of 22. By now he's naturally well into his 30s, but nevertheless he still has both a very youthful look but also a youthful reputation, you could say. He is often seen in social media as well, meeting with other party supporters, which are often in their late teens or early 20s. In general, if we look at opinion polls, the Confederation Party used to be a party that was mainly supported by young men, but according to recent polls, young women are also increasingly supporting them. When it comes to young men between the age of 18 and 24, according to some polls, it's almost 50% now that are voting for the Confederation Party.
Right, okay, so they're the ones to watch. Now let's talk about some policies then. Now, migration, I know, is a big one. What separates the two main parties as far as migration is concerned?
Probably credibility, to be honest. Recently, the opposition party, the Civic Platform Party of Donald Tusk, voiced some criticism against the government, claiming that they have been taking in too many migrants from the Muslim world, which is quite an unusual narrative to hear from a party that in the European Parliament belongs to the European People's Party, or the EPP, which usually are not as critical against migration from outside the EU. Nevertheless, Poland is a bit of a particular case. it seems that they came to the conclusion that in order to have a chance, or any chance at all, to win this election, they have to join the bandwagoning when it comes to criticizing migration. When it comes to the ruling party, they have since day one, when they won their first recent term in office back in 2015, it was on the back of the European migration crisis of 2015, when German Chancellor Angela Merkel famously invited especially refugees or asylum seekers from Syria to go to Europe.
This was the famous "we can handle it" comment that she made, is that
Absolutely, the "wir schaffen das" that in hindsight seems to have been quite inaccurate. Back then, there was the first attempt of introducing this mandatory migrant relocation quota system. Back then it was temporary. What the European Union is proposing now is a permanent change to the system. But according to that temporary attempt back in 2015, Poland was supposed to receive 7,000 quota migrants. The government in power back then, which was under Prime Minister Ewa Kopacz, because by then Donald Tusk had already left for his position as the president of the European Council. Nevertheless, he was the one pulling the strings and was really deciding what was going on here in Poland. They decided to accept these 7,000 quota migrants. But before the EU was able to send any, there were elections in Poland. The Law and Justice Party came to power, and they quickly told the EU that they simply wouldn't take any of those migrants. They fell into line with the rest of the Visegrad group, as Slovakia, Czechia, and Hungary had all previously stated that they wouldn't take any of those quota migrants either. So the Law and Justice Party, they came to power in 2015 on a anti-mass migration rhetoric, and now they have been riding on that ever since. Naturally, in 2021, when the Belarusian regime started flying in thousands and thousands of migrants, economic migrants from all over the world, really, even from Cuba, but the lion's share were from Africa and the Middle East. The Belarusian security services were organizing these corridors from the airport in Minsk to the Polish border, and then they were trying to help them cross illegally into Poland. The Poles viewed this as a weapon of hybrid warfare, a case of weaponized migration, and they decided to build initially a border fence, which was temporary, and then they quickly built a border wall as well. This 5-meter high border wall, which is full of electronic detectors that can spot migrants from far away and alert the border security, stretches for nearly 300 kilometers along the border with Belarus. It was initially opposed by the main opposition party, the Civic Platform Party. There were many activists from that party, MPs, even vice speakers of the Senate, that went out to the border and were basically verbally abusing the Polish border guards and Polish soldiers that had been sent there to keep the migrants away. So this is something that the Poles remember, and this change in rhetoric now from the opposition party, claiming that the government has not done enough to keep these migrants away, it rhymes poorly with what they themselves did just a few years back.
Okay, so migration is one of the strong points, you're saying, of the Law and Justice Party. Now, they also have one or two weak points, if I'm not mistaken, and one of those is abortion. Can we talk briefly about that?
Absolutely.
I'll let you talk. You're the
Yes.
expert, but
No,
they lost some support on this issue, correct?
Yes. When it comes to abortion, the main showdown came in 2020 when there was an initiative from the ruling party to ask the tribunal, the tribunal court that decides on whether something is constitutional in Poland or not. They asked the constitutional tribunal whether the Polish abortion law was as it should be. the tribunal came to the conclusion that there was an abortion compromise that was made in the early 90s, which was made by the conservatives, the progressives, and the church also was an arbitrary, the Catholic Church, naturally. And it basically stated that abortion would be illegal, except in the cases of incest, of rape, and when the mother's life is in danger, or when there are such severe diseases or disfigurations of the fetus that there will be a low quality of life. The tribunal came to the conclusion that this last one, that these fetuses which have various forms of disfigurations, they should, after all, have their life protected according to the Polish constitution. So when this ruling came and the Law and Justice Party adhered to it, is when mass demonstrations started in Poland. This was in the autumn of 2020, so it was a very special time. It was the first year of the coronavirus pandemic, so people had been told to stay indoors for months and months leading up to those protests. And also in the US, we had the George Floyd and Black Lives Matter protests that had been taking place during the spring and summer. So there was probably some inspiration for the young people of Poland, mainly them, which took to the streets in the autumn of 2020 protesting against this change in the abortion law. The protests were truly huge. They were probably the largest protests that have taken place in Poland since the fall of communism in 1989, and it was also visible in opinion polls that the ruling party, which up until that point had around 43, 44, maybe even 45% support, they fell down to around 35, 36. Since then they have gained a little bit. Now they're probably somewhere up around 38. But nevertheless, they have never returned to those highs that they had before the abortion controversy.
Okay. Let's move on to Poland and Brussels, the European Union. The Brussels Signal Studio is right in the center of the EU quarter. Now, obviously, there's been a lot of talk about the appointment of judges, and then we have the European Commission refusing to sign off on a lot of money for Poland. I mean, is it fair to say, let's put it this way, how do most Poles feel about the money issue? Do they feel like the European Commission is holding Poland to ransom, or is it divided? Or what's your feeling about the Poles and their attitude towards the European Commission today?
You can say that most Poles are split along party lines. The people that support the opposition, at least the progressive part of the opposition, since technically the Confederation Party is also part of the opposition, but those progressive people in the opposition, they claim that it is simply the Polish government that is at fault, since it has introduced legislation which they deem not to be in accordance with the principles of rule of law. Those who support the government, on the other hand, they claim that this is simply political interference from Brussels and Berlin, which is trying to change power in Warsaw. And then you have the Confederation Party, who practically blames the government for being poor at negotiations, claiming that they should have seen this coming and that they should have been much firmer when negotiations were taking place for the next 7-year budget, for example, back in 2021. They claim that the government should have threatened to use the veto unless there was a very clear agreement that would benefit the Polish government. Instead, they claim that the government negotiated away some of its powers to this ever increasingly centralized European Union, and they now blame the government for not having played their cards well enough. But theoretically, they are in agreement with the government that Brussels is trying to usurp power that it doesn't really have any mandate for.
That's an interesting point you make, because as there aren't many vetoes left in the European Union, vetoing the budget is in fact one of the few things that national governments can do. But is this an election issue, or is this marginal?
It's fairly marginal, actually. It was stirring up more emotions maybe a year and a half ago or two. Now, in the lead up to the election night, it's not really something that you hear that much about. A couple of days ago, there was a statement by Donald Tusk saying that if he wins the election, then the first thing he will do is to go to Brussels.
Unlock the money, yes, I saw that.
And unlock the money immediately, which the government claims that this only shows that it is a political issue, and that that Brussels is simply freezing this money until there is somebody from the opposition that is in power.
So we can call, well, from a Brussels perspective anyway, Poland and other countries such as Hungary are sort of more critical or Eurosceptic, for want of a better word, of the European Union. But I'm right, I think, in saying that there is no groundswell, no movement to actually leave the EU. Is anyone talking about leaving the EU in Poland?
No, at least not in any serious form. There were some battles waged between the ruling party and the opposition a few years back, when the opposition claimed that what the government was doing was practically moving Poland away from the European Union. Back then, the Polish president Andrzej Duda, which is naturally originally from the same political formation as the current government, he stated that he was even willing to have a referendum whether Poland's EU membership should be part of the constitution. And this is something that the opposition has later been using, that this is something that should have happened. But we all know that in Poland, somewhere around 80-85% of Poles, they support Poland being in the European Union. It's the highest figure out of all member states. There is simply no space for any political formation to grow large and at the same time be for a Pole exit. Even the Confederation Party, which has many issues with the EU and are technically for as strong as possible Polish national sovereignty, even they say that simply in this environment that we have here in Poland, being for a Pole exit is suicidal. We would consider leaving the EU at a point when public opinion has changed and there is a majority in Poland for leaving the EU, but it's not something that they would run on as is.
That's interesting. Why do you think that is? I mean, obviously, the right to work anywhere in the European Union, from the people's point of view, that must be one of the benefits of the European Union. Well, why do you think support is so high despite this conflict?
It is, but it must be said that recently it has diminished. Since the COVID year of 2020, there has been a reversal in the trend of Poles moving abroad for work. These days, more Poles are moving back to Poland than Poles are leaving Poland in search for work abroad. So right now there is a shift in that trend. So it's not as important as it was 12, 13 years or so ago, when truly hundreds of thousands of Poles were leaving Poland everywhere, looking for better fortune in Western Europe. I would say that when it comes to EU membership, there are probably two main reasons. One is simply access to the internal market. The Polish economy is very export-driven. It is based to a large degree on manufacturing, especially the automobile industry. However, it's maybe not as dependent on that industry as certain smaller countries here in Central Eastern Europe, such as Czechia, Slovakia, or Hungary for that matter. But nevertheless, access to the internal market for Poland's export-driven economy is key, and most Poles are aware of this. The second issue is more with identity. Poland, despite having fallen into the category of belonging to Eastern Europe after 1945, when Europe was divided with the Iron Curtain descending across the continent, the Poles feel that they have been placed in this Eastern Europe category by Westerners mistakenly. Poland has been a part of the Roman Catholic Church, not the Orthodox Byzantine world. It uses the Latin alphabet, and it considers itself a constituent part of the 1,000 years old European community. So it views itself very much as the Czechs, as a part of Central Europe, and as a part of especially Western civilization in general. So it does not look favorably upon this Eastern European label that is put on it. And it feels that its inclusion into the European Union in 2004 and in NATO in 1999, Pope John Paul famously stated that those changes, they meant that Europe was finally breathing with both its lungs again, unlike previously when only Western Europe was included. So the Poles believe that their membership in the EU, it shows that they are a part of Western civilization, and this is where they want to be.
That's fascinating. We've touched on migration, but of course now this connects with our next topic, which is Ukraine and the war, because obviously you have the migration from the south of the Mediterranean Sea, and then you have the many migrants who have entered Poland from Ukraine. Is this one issue or is it two issues?
Oh, it's definitely two issues. In Poland, these two groups of migrants are viewed very differently. There were a lot of comparisons that were made, as in 2021, Poland spent a lot of energy and resources on building this initially temporary border fence and later on permanent border wall to stop the thousands of migrants from Africa and the Middle East trying to cross into Poland illegally from Belarus. But then a few months later, Poland took in over 1 million Ukrainian refugees, and they did so without any debate in the country. It was simply something that everybody agreed on. And the Poles, they took great pride in the fact that they did not have to build any huge asylum centers. They did not have to turn certain sports arenas or conference facilities into temporary asylum centers. Instead, Polish families simply opened their homes to these Ukrainian refugees, and they often housed them for 3, 4, 5, or even 6 months before the refugees were able to find their own homes on the Polish housing market. So the Poles, they take great pride in the help that they gave to the Ukrainian refugees, but it was also very clear that the people that were coming in from Ukraine in 2022, 80% or so were women with young children. If we compare it with the migration flows back in 2015 during the European migration crisis, or even if we just look at the migrants trying to cross into Poland from Belarus, these migrants from the Middle East and Africa, there we have the complete reversal, where 80 or 90% of the migrants coming in are young men. Young men in their late teens or early 20s or maybe even 30s. So the Poles, they consider these migrants as economic migrants that are looking for a better quality of life. They absolutely understand that that is in the interest of those migrants. But at the same time, the Poles, they have a certain feeling that Poland back at the end of the 18th century up until the end of the First World War was partitioned by 3 other powers for 123 years and did not exist as an independent state on the political map of Europe. Later on, they faced the Second World War with its destruction, and then followed by nearly 5 decades of a planned economy and communist oppression. The Poles feel that this is their moment. They have finally been given a window of opportunity during which they can build up the economy of their country, during which they can increase their quality of life. They believe that this is something that they have been deserving for a long time. And watching developments in Western Europe, looking at the fiasco with integrating migrants there from Africa and the Middle East, this is something that the Poles simply do not want to repeat. They believe that they have seen the warning signs on the sky from the experiences of Western Europe, and they do not want to repeat what they believe to be a mistake.
Okay, let's carry on for our last few minutes with Ukraine, if we may. Now, is it fair to say that relations between Poland and Ukraine are cooling? Is that fair?
Cooling might be maybe a bit of a stretch, but you are right in the fact that there is a certain trend. If we look at opinion polls, initially, early on in the conflict, somewhere around 90% of Poles stated that they were clearly on Ukraine's side in this conflict. And now that has dropped slightly to the high 70s. So it's still a very high degree of support for the Ukrainian war effort here in Poland in a European perspective. However, it is slightly lower than it was at the early start of the conflict. There are some problems when it comes to unsolved issues from history. The Poles, they do still remember the so-called Volhynian massacre from the Second World War, in which Ukrainian nationalist groups brutally slaughtered tens of thousands of Polish civilians in what is today Western Ukraine, but before the Second World War were part of Eastern Poland. The Poles believe that this amounts to a genocide, and they believe that the Ukrainian side owes them an official apology, admitting that this was a campaign of genocide. And also they believe that the Ukrainians should allow the Poles to exhume many of these victims, which are still buried in unmarked mass graves across Western Ukraine. For the Ukrainians, this is something that for the first part, they simply have not been taught in their educational system. It is not something that is mainstream knowledge in Ukraine. Some history professors might accept this view, but the general population will not. And also it has to be said that since 2014, Ukraine is under attack by Russia, and therefore also nationalist sentiment and national pride is at an all-time high, and it is unlikely that the Ukrainians would be willing to take the Polish position on this issue. This is one problem, and what makes it even more complicated is the fact that the Russian propaganda machine is trying to split the Poles and the Ukrainians. This cooperation that has been going on, in which Poland has sent enormous quantities of military hardware, heavy weapons to Ukraine, has been a great problem for the Russians, and therefore they are likely to try to do anything they can to create spite between the Poles and the Ukrainians and get Poland to stop supporting Ukraine as intensely as they have until this point.
Right, and my final question, briefly, that leads me on to the build-up in the Polish military forces. Of course, it's been quite substantial, big increase in the budget, right? And am I right in thinking that this is a concern as well?
Absolutely. Just yesterday, the Poles announced that they have signed another 4 or 5 major military contracts. The most important of them is for the second phase of the so-called Wisła air defense program, in which Poland will acquire another 6 batteries of the Patriot missile defense system. That means more than 40 Patriot launchers that will be able to, together with the 2 previous batteries that Poland bought a few years ago and arrived just a few weeks ago. This means that these 8 batteries in total will be able to cover the entire Polish territory from potential missiles. Also, the Poles yesterday signed another framework contract for 1,700 reconnaissance drones from the company FlyEye. They also signed contracts for shorter range air defense system, the so-called NAREW program. So just yesterday, the Polish defense minister signed contracts to the worth of $25 billion, which is an enormous sum. These are naturally programs that will unfold over the next 7, 8, or even 9 years. So it will be spread out. But nevertheless, Polish military expenditure has risen from 2%, slightly above 2% last year, to 3.9% this year. Next year, they are already saying that it will be well above 4%. At the start of the war in Ukraine, the leader of the ruling party in Poland, Jarosław Kaczynski, stated that Poland's goal is to reach 5%. So it does seem that they are on track to reach 5%. The US is at around 3.5%. So the US will have the second highest military expenditure in NATO. Poland will by far have the highest. And in combination with Poland's growing economy, it means that a lot of this money will be spent on new weapon systems. This is also another issue that in other countries, a lot of the money is spent on retirement paychecks, for example. Here in Poland, they have decided that 50% will be earmarked to acquiring new weapon systems. So a lot of it is going into military hardware.
That's great, Adam. We've run out of time. I really appreciate it. Maybe it's great to see you on the video, and I know that you come to Brussels from time to time. Let's do another one on the elections or just after the elections from the studio itself. How about that?
That sounds excellent. Hopefully see you soon in that case.
Thanks again, Adam. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching.